IPS has 5 research clusters looking at key domestic policy issues. The head of the Society and Identity Cluster and one of the lead researchers behind today's conference, Dr. Matthew Matthews, will now share with you the findings of a landmark survey on race, language, and religion. For those of you who are interested in getting a copy of Dr. Matthews' presentation, the slides are now available for download at the IPS website. Dr. Matthew.
Thank you, all distinguished guests. Happy to present to you findings from the IPS survey on race, language, and religion, some key insights from there. Discourse on our differences, especially those related to race, religion, language, and nationality, have taken on 2 forms. One, that these differences are fault lines that reveal that we are fragile as a nation-state. We are but an imagined community formed together because of colonial interests, which has inevitably led people from very disparate places to find a common destiny. The nation-state project is still a work in progress, and a serious identity separate from these differences is unachievable in the next decades. Thus, we must maintain vigilance, since the harm related to the exploitation of these sensitivities can destroy Singapore. The second view is that we have overemphasized the presence of these differences, and by doing so have actually reinforced their presence. In reality, many Singaporeans seem to be no longer entrenched in their racial, religious, or linguistic identity, but separated by other differences such as socio-economic status, the digital divide, cultural capital. We must be frank and confront our differences and give greater emphasis to the Singaporean identity which is swiftly forming. As we strive towards such an identity, citizens can realize the aspirations of the pledge, regardless of race, language, and religion. Both of these arguments are tenable. What can support the validity of either is an assessment of the extent that innate differences continue to be a source of discomfort in Singapore. Fortunately, we don't have a lot of data in the public domain to be able to make good sense of this. As such, in 2012, the Institute began work on a large-scale survey. We consulted many stakeholders in terms of what should be measured and began data collection in late December 2012 and completed it in April 2013. Altogether, more than 4,100 Singaporean residents provided their feelings and attitudes about their lived experience. Let me begin first by looking at the whole idea about identity. What is important to Singaporeans in terms of who they are and what makes them feel that they have a particular kind of identity? We looked at a number of different variables. 79% of survey respondents indicated that Singapore was important or very important to their identity. There was consensus among 73% of respondents that while the language they spoke most frequently was important or very important, while 71% agreed to such salience accorded to race. Religion was important to 57% of the respondents. If we exclude respondents who claim to have no religion, this figure goes up to 70%. About 55% of respondents remarked that the country where their family came from was an important part of their identity. When you look at those who say that the country of their family was important to who they are, we notice that there are more Malays and Indians who feel this compared to Chinese. If we cut the data a little closely and look at those who are citizens and those who are PRs, who claim that their families were an important part of their identity, we notice that among local-born Singaporeans, which is what you see in the blue bar there, 49% of Chinese, 63% of Indians, and 68% of Malays indicated such importance. Among new citizens who had been in Singapore for less than 10 years, seen in the red bar, 61% of Chinese and 74% of Indians indicated such importance. We had hardly any Malay PRs in our data set, so we cannot make comments on that group. For the analysis, we looked at the whole idea about race and how important that was to our overall sense of identity. We noticed that this was particularly important for Singaporean Malays. Now, the other charts I used important and very important, and I lumped them together, and this chart just shows people who felt that this particular identity was very important to them. 52% of Malays stated that race was very important to identity, compared to 23% of Chinese and 28% of Indians. If you look at religion, then we notice again, when it comes to the Singaporean Malay population, 70% considered religion very important to them, compared to 16% of Chinese and 37% of Indian. The high level of consensus among Malays with the salience of race and religion was observed across educational, socioeconomic, or age profiles. 65% of Malays between 18 to 25 years of age, the first bar, stated that religion was very important to their identity, just as 64% of Malays with university qualifications. This clearly was different for Chinese and Indians, where you notice those who are much more educated and younger seem less likely to rank race and religion as very important to their identity. This is not in the slides, but among Indians, for instance, among those with secondary education, 52% ranked the race as very important to their overall identity. But when we look at university-educated Indians, 29% of them indicate such importance, so a gap of about 20%. It's quite possible that for the more educated class of Indians and Chinese respondents, access to the different forms of social capital reduces the salience of race and religion in their lives. The relatively strong identification with race and religion for Malays, however, is not entirely surprising and should not be viewed as a certain kind of Malay chauvinism. As with minority groups elsewhere, it is normal to exhibit a strong sense of identification to their respective racial or religious group to provide them a sense of stability in a broader society which is different. However, this should not obscure from the fact that generally Singaporeans still identify strongly with race, religion, or nationality. Singaporeans, because they identify strongly with race, language, and religion, at least it's important for many Singaporeans, does this mean that we are more prone to prejudicial feelings to others in our attempts to create boundaries? Prejudice has negative consequences for society as it reduces trust in others and heightens feelings of animosity between different groups. In this study, we asked questions which measure the respondents' perception on various forms of prejudice today with the situation 5 years ago. Here there's an assumption that prejudice has always been there at some time, and we're asking our respondents what they thought in terms of the development and change in terms of levels of prejudice. The results are here. How much prejudice do you think there is today in Singapore compared to 5 years ago? And you notice a number of bars there: race, religion, language, gender, age-related, and nationality. If you notice, the red segment is really about the same. So the bulk of respondents indicated that compared to 5 years ago, the level of prejudice encountered is about the same. The pattern is generally consistent even when we break this down by age profiles or race, religion, educational levels, income levels. Let's look at race first. 14% of Chinese claim that there was more or much more racial prejudice, the top part in green, compared to 5 years ago, compared to 21% of Malays and 20% of Indians. But in fact, 36% of Malays, which you see in the blue bar, and 37% of Indians reported there was lesser prejudice today. Looking at religious prejudice, well, 9% of Chinese stated there was more religious prejudice, 15% of Malays and 12% of Indians concurred with this. What about language prejudice? There's slightly more who claim that prejudice based on language had increased, with 18% of Chinese, 21% of Malays, and 20% of Indians. Again, at the same time, you have those who would say it actually has reduced. On gender, there was comparatively little feelings about prejudice. In fact, if you look at women, the second bar, 43% acknowledged that there was less prejudice today, while only 8% stated there was more prejudice. What about when we look at age prejudice? Here's a graph, and we only scope those who had who were tertiary educated, those with diploma or higher. It's not university, as the slide says, it's tertiary. Among those with post-secondary education, 31% of those between 51 to 65 years of age felt that there was more prejudice compared to 14% of those who are between 26 to 35 years. Prejudice by nationality particularly heightened among those who were younger and who were graduates. Among local-born Chinese Singaporeans, as you can see in the first bar there, and in the green segment, which is much more prejudice, 50% of those between 26 to 35 years of age believe that there was more prejudice based on nationality. On the whole, graduates were more likely to believe this, with 47% of Chinese, 46% of Indians, and 44% of Malays stating this. Moving on from prejudice, we examine its subtler variant, digging into the everyday lived experiences of people living in Singapore. In the survey, several sets of questions were asked to find out if respondents had different experiences living in Singapore because of their race, religion, or language, or perceived that there would be different experiences for people because of these language or racial background. Mr. Janadas Devan just showed you earlier the slide about people's perceptions about the use of public services. Again, the red portion is about the same. So when people compared themselves with other races in terms of how they would be treated in different kinds of public services, they mentioned that their experience would be about the same. And we looked at all kinds of public services. The little small blue portion right at the bottom is about those who felt that they were treated much worse. And there's a very, very small proportion. Even when we look at minorities, the highest proportion is 7%. What about discrimination when it comes to the workplace? We saw this a little bit more marked for minorities when it came to employment. Although the figures are not alarmingly high, when asked whether they were ever felt racial discrimination, so it's ever felt, obtaining a job or promotion, 26% of Malays and 24% of Indians indicated this. This is compared to 6% in the case of Chinese respondents. Malays and Indians were more likely than Chinese to report that they felt discriminated because of language when applying for a job or when being considered for a job promotion. 81% of Chinese had never or rarely felt this way, compared to 57% of Malays and 64% of Indians. The bar here is about how hard do you think people with different language preferences have to work in order to have a prosperous life in Singapore? So different preferences, English, Mandarin, Malay, Tamil, or dialect. Relatively few, 11% of respondents, thought that those who preferred to speak English would have to work harder, or much harder than those others to have a prosperous life in Singapore. However, nearly half, 52%, felt that those who preferred to speak dialect had to work harder. 44% indicated this when it comes to speaking Tamil, 41% for those who would speak Malay as the main language, and 28% for those who would prefer to speak Mandarin. The figures then clearly show that a perception that English language preference was associated with the possibility of greater economic achievement. In fact, 36% of respondents said that those who have English-speaking preferences had to work less hard compared to others. You notice that in the arrow pointing there. Again, by race, we see that few saw those with English-speaking preferences as disadvantaged. Right at the top there, which is about, if you feel you have to work harder, the green portion. Across the board, it's about 10 to 17%. On the other hand, minorities were less likely to believe that those who prefer to speak Mandarin had to work harder. While 13% of Chinese believed this, 28% of both Malays and Indians and 31% of Indians felt that Malay speakers were going to be less burdened. You notice that from the blue bars at the bottom. The Malays and Indians certainly think highly of Chinese language-based social networks for enhancing socioeconomic status. Across the board, when you look at different languages, most people are cognizant about the fact that minority languages, Malay, Tamil, or even dialects, will not allow people, or it will be much more challenging for them to become prosperous. They have to work much harder. So you notice there's about 41% for the case of Malays. For the case of Tamils, again the 40s. And for dialects, the Chinese, for Chinese, 56% of them feel that if you speak dialect, you have to work much harder. Despite the differential treatment that some minorities felt in the context of employment, there did not seem to be any systematic racial or religious tension or animosity between races or religious groups. This is clearly borne out by the fact that there were very few respondents who had experienced potentially racially or religiously tense situations in the previous 2 years. Respondents were asked about the frequency of them feeling upset due to a number of situations, including being insulted for their racial customs or religious beliefs, challenged about their religious beliefs or practices, and undesirable attempts to convert them to another faith. For each one of these items, as you can notice, there are fewer than 10% who often feel upset because of these insensitivities, the gray part of the bar. This, however, did not mean that there was no racial or religious tension in Singapore, but that such tense situations were infrequent and did not seem to be the cause of unhappiness for most Singaporeans. This is evident since the statement which we asked, overall I feel Singapore is free from religious tension, and a similarly worded statement, overall I feel Singapore is free from racial tension, was not unanimously agreed upon. About 60% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed to this statement, with about 26% to 28% choosing the somewhat agree option. It's quite possible in this case that the respondents had reflected on some tense but ambiguous encounters, but were not able to attribute the source of tension. This would explain why respondents were obviously cautious about declaring complete freedom from racial and religious tension in Singapore. Low tension does not mean no tension. Differences can be overwhelming and unbearable to deal with. People choose to indicate greater boundaries between themselves and others, especially when there are more uncertainties and they're concerned that their well-being is threatened. The survey showed that local-born Singaporeans had still some discomfort in a terrain where there were many non-Singaporeans. There's a constant discussion about the threat of new immigrants to economic, cultural, and social well-being. Despite the fact that new Singaporean citizens had given up their previous citizenship and had chosen to become part of Singapore, there was still some reservation on this. While 94% of respondents were comfortable with a local-born Chinese as their boss, only 74% were open to new Singaporean Chinese, who originally was from China. Similarly, even among local-born Chinese, 76% were comfortable having such a new Singaporean as a close friend. They were more comfortable with a local-born Malay or Indian in this regard. Linguistic differences were also an issue that some in the Singaporean population had greater difficulty accommodating to. When asked their agreement to the statement, I'm fine if people around me speak a language I do not speak, the first bar there, 52% of the sample agreed or strongly agreed. 29% chose the somewhat agree option, and 19% outright disagreed. When those who had university qualifications were compared, 59% of Chinese compared to 43% of Indians agreed. But asked for their agreement to the statement, I am fine if a public speech is made in an official language that I do not speak, there was only 39% who agreed. Again, when the different races were compared, among those with university education, what you see in the red bars there, 48% of Chinese, 27% of Malays, and 30% of Indians agreed. Less educated Malays and Indians, you see in the blue bar, were more agreeable, with 53% of Indians below secondary education and 41% of Malays with that same education agreeing to the statement. It's hard to conclude whether those with lesser education are more accepting of these differences, since in other parts of the survey, we did notice that among the better educated, there was greater intercultural understanding and interaction. However, it is possible to conclude that the lower educated minority groups are quite often used to encountering other languages in their daily lives by virtue of being in a social circle with less than proficient command of English or language they are familiar with. What's also clear, however, is that expectation among better educated minorities policies that ensure their inclusion. Another question similarly bears this point. And respondents were asked if they were fine if service staff did not speak to them in English in a shop in Orchard Road. Among graduates, while 30% of Chinese disagreed to this, 67% of Indians and 65% of Malays disagreed. The study also managed to measure, based on categories of race, religion, language, education, opinions about morality, because this is another form of difference in terms of how people believe and view the world. And we looked at a number of areas about morality, which are sometimes debated. Singaporeans were asked about whether they felt that a particular area of morality was something that was always wrong, almost always wrong, only wrong sometimes, not wrong most of the time, or not wrong at all. Overall, as you can see, Singaporeans are fairly conservative in their outlook to such issues. However, there are items which elicited stronger consensus, with more respondents alleging that the act was almost always wrong. As you can notice, the blue section, about 80%, for instance, said it's wrong to have sexual relations with someone other than your partner, and 73% about having pregnancy outside marriage. Again, when it comes to same-sex relations, it was always wrong for 61% of respondents and almost always wrong for 17%, making 78%. You can notice the figures are similarly high for gay marriage. And you can notice, even when you look at other kinds of social vices like gambling, it's similarly fairly high. When the data was analyzed by looking at it by religious affiliation, generally those who claimed to have no religion and Buddhists were Buddhists and Taoists were more liberal than those who are Christian and Muslim. Differences were marginal in some areas, but there was high consensus, such as homosexual relations and sexual affairs, but were more pronounced for other areas. For sexual relations before marriage, only about 38% of respondents who had no religion and 38% of Buddhists indicated this, that it was wrong or wrong always, whereas 89% of Muslims and 65% of Catholics and 5% of Christians agreed to this. You can similarly see this trend when we talk about living with your partner before marriage. Again, fewer of those with no religion or Buddhists or Taoists compared to those who are Muslim, Christian. Commentators frequently argue that social harmony in Singapore is attributable to state management. We know many aspects of state management which have been traditionally used, and Singapore's government and independence attempted to homogenize the racial and linguistic landscape, muting subgroup ethnic identities in preference for broader racial categories, such as the CMIO framework. Management of language often entailed restricting the use of dialects in the public sphere in preference for official mother tongue languages. In this particular slide, you see we asked a question about official categorization of in one's identity card versus how one would personally want to be identified. When we looked at that, we noticed that among most Singaporeans, Chinese, Malays, and Indians, the overwhelming proportion of them were very happy with the state-defined identity. Even those who were defined in subgroup identities like the Boyanese would prefer to be part of a larger identity like being Malay. We look at linguistic, when we look at the whole issue about dialects, for instance, and how some claim that dialects are being muted, we noticed that when linguistically the proportion of respondents who believed that their dialect was part of their overall identity was much smaller compared to those who believed that their official mother tongue was. Among young Chinese between 18 to 25 years of age, 35% stated that his dialect was an important part of their identity, compared to 58%, which you can see in the next slide, who said that about their mother tongue language. On the whole, there was comparatively less support for dialect use. The statement, people who use dialects or languages of ethnic subgroups should be given more recognition than those that they have. A strong agreement was 34% for Chinese, 30% for Malays, and 23% for Indians. Singapore population continues to expect the government to be responsible for linguistic, racial, and religious harmony. If you look at the blue bar, 64% of respondents in the survey agreed to the government's role in linguistic harmony. For 70%, the green bar agreed to the state's role in racial and religious harmony. Only 46%, though, agreed when asked about the state's performance in improving the integration of new immigrants. Not on this slide, but 61% of respondents felt the state had done a good job when it comes to improving racial and religious harmony. There's some diversity in terms of what respondents believe the government needed to do in managing the state of race, religion, and language in Singapore. For language management, there seemed to be less interest in state management. Looking at the bar in red, 58% agreed or strongly agreed that the government should not try to influence their personal language use. When asked about whether the government should do more to curb the use of Singlish in Singapore, fewer Chinese compared to minorities agreed to this. When it came to racial and religious harmony, there was more consensus about the importance of the state's continued intervention in these matters. Overall, 58% agreed or strongly agreed to the statement, we need more legislation and policies to safeguard racial and religious harmony, while 31% somewhat agreed. Among those who were younger, there was a general tendency to be less supportive of this, except for Malays. The call for government to give preferential or special treatment to minority groups was again better supported by minorities than majority members. As you can see in this slide, 24% of Chinese agreed or strongly agreed to this, compared to 41% of Malays and 34% of Indians. Even when you look at a younger cohort of respondents, those in 18 to 25, among the Chinese is about 19%, for Malays it's 45%. When we look at university-educated Malays, though, the proportion goes down to 28%. This pattern is quite consistent in many modern societies where the successful among minorities would prefer to ride on the self-made rhetoric on a society based on merit. Let me make some concluding points. Very clearly from our presentation, it's very clear that the traditional forms of ethnicity encompassing race, religion, language, nationality are still important, and it does predict some amount of attitudes and behavior. Differences, however, are more salient to minority members. They're inevitably concerned if their differences will result in prejudicial treatment towards them, which ultimately can affect their well-being. Since minorities experience race, religion, and language differently from majority members, it is important to ensure sensitivity to their unique experiences. This is challenging for majority members who often are not aware of the subjective experiences of minorities. What is problematic for minorities may have no bearing at all in the life experience of majority members. The example of language use in public addresses and shops in Orchard Road bear witness to this fact. More so, the smaller number of Chinese who support preferential treatment for minorities compared to Malays and Indians. Should then the formulation and practice of public policy then heed the sentiments of the majority or the sensibilities of the minority who are likely to be sensitive to a larger array of issues? There's a greater sensitivity to minority concerns that erode the principles of fairness, which has been an inalienable part of policy formulation in Singapore. The survey results also show that while Singapore society is generally conservative, there are differences in attitudes between those who belong to some religious faiths and those who are not. What are the implications of these divisions? Will it necessarily lead to a cultural war, as some have seen in other parts of the Western world? Since public morality cannot be easily disengaged from religious beliefs or values, is it realistic to expect that future debates about hot-button moral issues maintain secularity, or should religious voices be part of such discussion? What if a coalition of Muslim and Christians and those who have no religion and Buddhists and Taoists decide to push public debates on moral issues? Will this cause irreparable fractures in Singapore society? What about the world of the survey shows the general satisfaction of Singaporeans to state management of race, religion, and language. This cannot be said about immigration, where most Singaporeans disagree as to whether the government has done enough to ensure better integration. Moreover, Singaporeans sense that nationality-based prejudice has substantially increased, while many other forms. Considering the state's success in handling the historical differences of race, religion, and language, and even gender and age, are differences based on nationality or previous nationality too difficult to bridge? that an all-out strategy to deal with nationality-based prejudice warranted with heavy enforcement on xenophobic tendencies in the cyber world? Is that necessary? Or is it likely to have a quicker effect in dealing with the nationality divide, which is causing some disconcern? The survey data has allowed us to peek into the complex workings of Singapore's multicultural system. In many ways, Singapore's multiculturalism has worked, especially in the public sphere, where there is a recognition that by Singaporeans that all citizens are treated fairly. The data, though, points out to certain fault lines in our system, fault lines in race relations, nationality, and to some extent how people view matters of morality. While acknowledging the problems of the multicultural system is certainly an exercise in humility, it begs the question whether anything more needs to be done about this. A perfectly harmonious system is a far-fetched utopia. Finding consensus on many of these contentious matters seems to be an impossibility. Can we then accept that the new normal in Singapore today is one where we acknowledge that differences arising from our past and new differences as part of life and will cause us some amount of discomfort, but if it's managed aptly, will need not leave scars on a nation-building project? Thank you very much.